Welcome to International Tax Bites, a series of conversations around issues and concepts in international taxation. I'm Grahame Jackson, and I'm a Gibraltar and English solicitor with Hassan's international law firm in Gibraltar. Today I will be speaking to my podcast partner Harriet Brown, who is a Jersey advocate and English barrister with Old Square Tax Chambers in London.
So, Harriet, here we are for the last episode of the series, which is very exciting. And we decided to do something a bit historical today, didn't we?
We did, but as I know nothing about history and I don't trust what you know about history, we've got somebody to come and tell us all about it.
We have. But the history that we're going to cover is we were talking, weren't we, about how the tax base in the UK is really quite complex. And it hasn't always been that complex. And we were wondering how it got to be where it is today.
Yes. So I think one of those facts that everybody who works in tax knows is why we first got income tax.
Yes, which was the Napoleonic Wars, right?
It was. And income tax theoretically is quite simple because we still have that annual tax, but it's not at all the same as it was back then.
No. So there were big changes, weren't there? So war drives changes, essentially. And there were big changes in the 20th century and various crises. So the tax base in the UK as it is now is basically a product of the 20th century. Would you say?
Well, I think we should probably ask our guest that. But yes, it's certainly been a response to what has happened. And of course, you see that across the world, that as countries really develop, the tax system changes and develops along with those social, political, cultural changes. Yeah.
So what we need is a guest who knows about the social, cultural and political changes of the 20th century in the UK, don't we?
We do, yes, because that's about as far as we can go, as far as I can go on it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can tell you things about the 20th century basically because I've read some of his books and watched his teleseries. So let me just introduce our guest, which is wholly improbable that he's agreed to come on. But we have with us today Dominic Sandbrook, who is an excellent guest, hopefully, and was educated at Oxford and Cambridge. He's written the leading multi-part history of modern Britain, books like Never Had It So Good, White Heat, State of Emergency, Seasons in the Sun, Who Dares Wins. I first saw him when I sort of was flicking through the channels and saw his series on the 1980s. On BBC Two, which was absolutely fantastic. Then we spent quite a lot of time sitting in the back of a Morris Minor doing pieces to camera. And he now co-presents with another historian called Tom Holland, a podcast called The Rest is History, which our Twitter followers will know I, because you didn't contribute like I asked you to, number one podcast last year on our podcast poll that I did. And also, most importantly, he's from the mighty county of Shropshire. A Salopian. We have a Salopian on the podcast, don't we? So, Dominic, thank you so much for agreeing to be here.
Thank you very much. I had never imagined that we would win the coveted title of the International Tax Bites top history podcast, but that is an honor. I will carry that with me in my heart to the grave.
There wasn't a trophy this year, but there might well be next year, and I'm sure
you probably won't win next year. Then that's just
so you will get your unique mug that all of our guests get.
Really?
Yes. Wow. Which you will hopefully tweet.
I came on even without knowing there was a mug. So I mean, if I'd known there was a mug, I'd have given you days of material.
Okay.
As it is,
you never know.
You just get hours.
We have got extensive notes, and your books are quite lengthy. So if you remember half of what's in there, we've got quite a lot of time.
Oh, I don't remember anything in those books. If you've had me on under the false impression that I'm going to be able to remember what I wrote in my own books, then this will be a very short podcast.
I'm so glad that there's somebody else who's prepared to say that publicly, because I can never remember what I've written. Because you said this, and you think, did I? Yeah. Well, I might well have meant that, and I'd be interested to see it again. I'm sure I probably agree with it, but I don't remember it.
We did do an episode which I entirely structured around one of Harriet's articles, which she'd completely forgotten she'd written.
Right. Well, I'm glad it's not just me. Yeah, I mean, that's...
Okay, so Dominic, do you want to take us through the context of 1945? I mean, we've just won the war. Britain's just won the war. It's all good, right? The empire's intact. Everything's fine. Churchill standing on the balcony waving to the crowds, and the economy's brilliant. I would assume.
No, well, you know perfectly well that that's not the case at all. So to go back to something you said in the introduction about the tax structure being formed through crisis, I think that's absolutely right. I think that the tax system is actually a little bit like the welfare state. So it's one of those things that's kind of you wouldn't design it from scratch. It's sort of layer upon layer accretions done by successive political administrations as a sort of at each time a kind of ad hoc response to an emergency or a challenge. So actually, you could argue that both the tax system and the welfare state develop kind of hand in hand. And there's a general, you were saying about countries and their tax systems and how they develop. Basically, the role of the state increases enormously in the 20th century, and that's a large part of the story. And wars obviously drive that. So in 1945, you've had the Second World War, and you've had a massively expanded role of the state, huge amount of borrowing. You're right that everybody's very jolly. Well, they're not jolly, actually. They're relieved. They're delighted the war is over, but they're exhausted, and they're kind of... there's a kind of sort of... There's just a general sense of fatigue, I guess. So economic, sort of moral, kind of psychological... the empire is kind of intact, yes, but it's some of it has had to have been reassembled, because in Asia, for example, it has been, the Japanese had taken Singapore and taken much of the Far East and so on. So Britain has had to kind of almost reoccupy some of those places. That's expensive. Stationing troops overseas is very expensive. We've obviously run up colossal debts to the Americans in order to pay for the war. So and the thing is, it's not just one war. It's 2 world wars. So Britain is the only country that has gone through, it's the only country that went through both world wars from start to finish and won both of them. But to do that was enormously expensive. And the irony is, of course, going into the First World War was largely done because of fear that if we didn't, the empire would be threatened. But in a way, the great irony of fighting the 2 world wars is that in order to do it, we basically ensured that the empire would go, and defending it is a very expensive process, because, we've effectively bankrupted ourselves. So when Clement Attlee comes in, so he comes in before the end of the Second World War. The war in Japan is not yet over. When the Labour government come in 1945 with their plans for the New Jerusalem and expanded welfare state, major nationalizations and so on, the economy, the government's finances are under enormous strain. And it's not, if you think about all the different, so they've got their manifesto commitments. They want to build homes for heroes, which we didn't really do. Well, we did, but not as much as people had hoped after World War One. So they want to do all that. They want to create a safety net. They have these grand ambitions, the Labour Party, because of course they haven't been in power since 1931. But there's also the challenge overseas of the Cold War. So World War II is over, but a new conflict is at hand. The expense of nuclear weaponry, the expense of keeping a British army on the Rhine, the expense of spending all this money to have troops in, as it will turn out in the next few years, in Malaya, in Kenya, and so on. So what you have is it's already quite an old government, the Attlee government of old men, who have all these kinds of pressures, and who basically, they don't have the money to pay for it all, and that puts the system under enormous strain.
So Harriet, can you give us a sense of what tools they had? What taxes did they have?
So back in the immediate post-war period, the tax system was much simpler and much cruder, almost, I think it's fair to say. So I think, Grahame, you and I have talked about at length the transfer of assets abroad regime, and that was really one of the very early tax avoidance measures. There were very few around this time, and so I think at this point, looking at the way legislation has developed, what you're looking at is sort of the development of those taxes and enforcing them with relatively crude tools. We know that nowadays it's getting harder and harder to hide income. And of course, really at that stage, there weren't the same sort of taxes on capital or gains But at that time, when everything was paper-based, it's not fair to say that tax was optional, but you certainly had a lot of options, and the government, the revenue, didn't have a great deal of tools to fight that, whether that be technological, like they do now with all of the information gathering, or even sort of legislative provisions that allowed them to dip in and stop that sort of thing. And it's really one of the things that I witter on about a lot, is the development of the Ramsey principle. And I think, just sorry to slip away into tax for just 30 seconds more, if tax had been focused on collection and sort of protecting revenues rather than generating new ones, we might well have seen that things like the Ramsey principle didn't develop in the way that they did, because there wouldn't have been that need for the courts to intervene. But that to me is a direct response of sort of the crudeness of the tax system at the time.
So we've introduced, in 1944, we've introduced what's called pay-as-you-earn, PAYE, which is an employment withholding tax, effectively a prepayment of tax. Previously, everybody had to file a tax return if they had income. And that's part of an expansion on the numbers of people who are paying tax. So I've got some figures. Harry, you know I've done a lot of research for this. I've got some figures, right?
So great figures, actually. You don't undersell your figures.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're much more. You were saying about the rest is history. Your notes are much better than the rest is history.
Okay. Well, by the way, as an aside, you've got to persuade Tom to come on and do tax in the classical world, right?
He hates economics. There's no way he'll. I mean, he is a horror of it. He doesn't know anything about it, Grahame.
Perhaps not.
Well, you've laid the gauntlet down now. He'll definitely come on. So, in 1911, there was only 1 million people, or there were only 1 million people paying income tax in the UK. By 1945, that had risen to 10 million. And that's partly because PAYE has been introduced. So cash payments, because this is an entirely cash-based economy, isn't it? There's no bank transfers. I mean, there are checks, but like, who wrote a check? I mean, I remember growing up in the 1970s, I had relatives that didn't know how to write a check.
Well, you have a lot of people, by the way, who don't have bank accounts. I mean, a very large proportion of the country don't even have a bank account in the 1940s.
People used to put a suit on to go and see their bank manager, didn't they?
Yeah.
Which is an entirely bizarre idea now that that would happen. I remember we used to pay, we obviously deducted, we had a small business and we obviously used to deduct the PAYE, but we paid people cash in an envelope with a payslip, handwritten payslip, because 50% of them didn't have a bank account. And that was in the 1990s. So it's entirely, this is, the tax authorities basically can't track. I think that's what you're saying, isn't it, Harriet? They can't track what's going on in the economy.
That's right. And PAYE, though possibly not at the time, very much has become a weapon. These sort of taxes, a bit like VAT, where you get somebody else to do it and somebody else to collect it and somebody else to report it, and you can give them financial consequences for doing it wrong. That is a huge leap forward.
Yeah.
In terms of pulling people into the tax net. And just on your figures, Grahame, that rise in the number of those paying income tax, not only is it a big rise in absolute terms, but percentage wise, it was a huge rise as well, just in terms of
gone up from, like, I don't know, 2% to 25%, hasn't it? Or
something like that.
That's why when you get to the 1940s or so, you see really, in a marked way, arguably for the first time, people complaining about tax in a really big way. 1950s. There's often a passage where the narrator or one of the characters will talk about the great house has fallen into decrepitude, or part of the great house has been knocked down or sold off, or the rich family have had to sell off a lot of land for a new housing estate because they can't pay their inheritance tax effectively.
Do you know what? I think that may even have made it into Enid Blyton, into some of the school stories.
Yeah.
So is this part of, Dominic, would you say that this is part of the same sort of like the broadening of our participation in politics and the state that go on with increase in, vote, everybody, universal suffrage, and everybody becomes a taxpayer and everybody goes off and gets drafted to go and fight in the Second World War. And so everybody is a true participant in the state.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. So you go back to the Napoleonic Wars where you started with the income tax. For most people in that period, and indeed for maybe 2-3 generations afterwards, the state really doesn't appear in your life very much at all. And when it does, it's for ill. So if the state intrudes in your life, it's in the context of you being sort of semi-press ganged into the army or the navy or something, or you being, the law intervening in your life in some way, but it's not really the state doing something for you. What obviously changes in the 20th century is that the state just becomes implicated in people's lives. The state runs, let's say, the railways, or it runs coal mines. The state, you have a ration book, you have identity papers, you have, you're called up, as you said, for national service in the 1940s and 1950s. And this sort of idea of, you see this a lot in kind of Tory propaganda of mid-century, the idea of the state with its kind of tentacles, spreading into your life. But obviously, this is a thing that governments of all parties kind of do. And tax is obviously one of the most sort of visible, most palpable ways that this happens. So filling in your tax return, or indeed the tax, as you say, with PAYE being deducted before you get it. So you see people sort of you have a development of two things, I guess. So one is statism, and the other is kind of anti-statism. At the same time, kind of going hand in hand, and that's why, if you watch any sitcom from the dawn of telly through to the sort of 1980s, people whinging about their tax returns. Sorry, whinging is a bit strong, but you know what I mean. It is always a big theme of it. It's the kind of thing that kind of your Basil Fawlty complains about, or Rigsby and Rising Damp, or any of those kinds of things. This idea that the state is kind of on your back the whole time, squeezing money out of you. People didn't really talk like that in the Victorian period.
But this is sort of in contradistinction to the position now, because it seems what you're saying is that any anger or dissatisfaction with the tax system was aimed at the state, whereas we now seem to live in a situation where anger and dissatisfaction is aimed at other taxpayers who aren't paying enough, in inverted.
Oh, yeah, there was a little bit of... So that's interesting. I think there was a definite... From the 70s onwards, we're leaping forward, so I know we will come back in a second. There definitely you start to get talk about scroungers, about people who have something for nothing, people who are not paying in but are getting too much out. But I think generally, yes, there's a more of now, 21st century, we look to the state automatically to do all kinds of things that people wouldn't have done a couple of generations ago. Your energy bills are too high, you expect the state to step in. COVID, you expect the state to set up a furlough scheme. For people living in the 1940s, these things are the idea, that expectation on the state is something new, and it's kind of really born of wartime, I think, born of the kind of collective efforts. Churchill had said when he became prime minister in 1940, the interests of property, the interests of labor are as nothing, compared with the great challenge that now confront us. That's a big reversal of the kind of laissez-faire ethos that a lot of people had taken for granted during most of the 19th century.
So let's just recap exactly how ambitious the Attlee government was. It's basically got no money because it's all been spent bombing Germany. Yeah. And then it comes in, there is a pre-existing welfare state, isn't there? Of a sort.
It's a myth that they create the welfare state. They don't create it out of nothing. The Liberals and then the Tories in the 1920s and 30s had extended deep in the welfare state. So there are, pensions and so on. But you're right, they want to build a much bigger welfare state.
I think they're in a sense privately insurance-based, that basically the thing that Nigel Farage keeps going on about that he wants us to do instead of the state paying for it, right?
Yeah.
So, which is the German system, I think, if I'm right.
Or most European systems. Actually.
Yeah, exactly. Which, you mention it and like the heavens fall, but then you say Germany's got a great system. I don't understand how that works, but you go. So they expand that massively. They basically nationalize the entire health system of Britain. And then they go and start nationalizing bits of industry as well, don't they?
Yeah.
They nationalize the railways.
The mines. Yeah, all that stuff.
Mines. National insurance itself is nationalized. But they're paying for this, aren't they? They're not doing like Russians. It's not like men in red hats walking in with guns and saying, this belongs to the government now. They're actually paying the owners.
Yeah.
So they're spending money like water.
Well, they are spending a lot of money, yes. At this at the same time as maintaining an army abroad, a massive army.
And building nuclear missiles.
And building nuclear missiles. Exactly. Yeah, they're spending an awful lot of money. I mean, it's hard to imagine. Sometimes there's a particular kind of Tory historian that says, "Oh, this is where it all went wrong for Britain. The Attlee government, spent far too much money, built too generous a welfare state." The trouble with that argument is our welfare state actually isn't very generous by European standards. But also, it's impossible to imagine a scenario in which any government would not have done those things. The public pressure to have a welfare state of that kind with a health service of some kind means that it almost certainly would have done. I mean, the famous metaphor that people use, and Aaron Bevan, when he set up the NHS, said basically he had to stuff the consultants' mouths with gold to get them to agree, because the doctors, the British Medical Association, were dead against the idea of kind of nationalized medicine. So that gives you some sense of this sort of image of stuffing people's mouths with gold gives you some sense of how expensive this was actually, and how then basically, I think what you get is the tax burden. Is it about 37%, the high 30s at the end of the 1940s, which is the highest ever in modern British history? So that gives you a sort of sense of and I think there's actually an expectation at the time among some people that it could go higher. That sense of the kind of the nationalization of public life paid for by tax revenues.
But did they think it was going to be paid for by tax revenues? I think I read somewhere, or I heard somewhere, that Bevan had this idea that as people got healthier because they were being treated, the cost of the NHS would go down.
Yeah, well, they definitely thought that. I mean, they thought there would be a, I don't know, 5-year, 10-year sort of spike, and then everyone would be very healthy. So they wouldn't need
in a world where everybody smoked and drank, right? Okay.
Yeah, people get old, unfortunately.
And did they think that the nationalised industries would return a surplus? Because
I'm sure they yes, they did.
Insane.
There's no sense. So obviously with the nationalised industries, we can look back now, and I think most people would look back now and say, unless you're incredibly doctrinaire, I would say a lot of people would look back now and say, you've got that political capital, as it were. You've got that little space at the end of World War II, while you're not as badly bombed out as your European competitors. What are you going to do with that moment? And I think a lot of people now would say, I don't think nationalising the coal mines is the future of economic policy in sort of 20th century Britain. But they've inherited a lot of baggage. They've got a lot of baggage from the 1920s and 30s. These are people who remember the general strike. They're, as I said, Ernest Bevan and Aaron Bevan, Clement Attlee, Stafford Cripps, Hugh Dalton. They're old men with old commitments. And they don't. It's as though they don't quite get, even at that point, that those heavy industries really are in the long run doomed. It doesn't occur to people that they're doomed, actually. They think they're the backbone of Britain. They think this is what has won us the war, industrial supremacy, mining, shipbuilding, steel making, all these things. So, they do nationalize them. And I think in retrospect, you kind of wish they hadn't, because I think it wasted a lot of time and effort and imagination that could have been spent on other things.
Yeah. So we have got one thing happening in the war, which prefigures what's going to happen later, which is the introduction of the purchase tax, Harriet.
Yes.
Do you know anything about the purchase tax?
I don't know an awful lot about the purchase tax, I have to say, because it's never, what I know tends to come up in the course of my practice. And this is, I think it was a foreshadow of VAT, as you say, Grahame, but it was quite different.
It was charged at the point of the wholesale event. It wasn't paid by the end user, was it? So it's basically like a one-phase type.
Exactly.
I remember seeing in my dad's business there being odd invoices floating around from pre-VAT that were never explained properly to me. But it was charged at different rates depending on the product, right? I read in Dominic's book. I can't remember which one it was. Anyway, at one point,
sales opportunity there, and you blew it.
I know. I'll
Don't worry.
Gone blank. I read in one of Dominic's books, White Heat.
Oh,
that the rate for cars at one point was 45%.
Yeah, they had different rates. I mean, it seems crazy now. Such a sort of bureaucratic, fiddly thing to do. They had different rates, and they had this sort of. I mean, that runs all the way through, doesn't it? This sort of sense that some products are luxuries, and therefore, some aren't. And there's always this slight sort of weird, I think, slight censoriousness.
Almost social engineering going on.
Yeah, you
I was
shouldn't
about
really be
to-
buying that, so we'll put an extra bit of tax on it.
I was about to say, is this sort of one of the early examples of using tax for social engineering? Because I think one of the things that the modern dialogue lacks is whether or not that's what tax collection should be about, but it seems to be accepted. And I don't think that's ever been something that's been discussed. Should we be using tax as a means of social engineering?
Death duty is a very early example of that. It was specifically used to destroy the landed aristocracy, to make them take the houses apart, sell bits off to build 3-bedroom semis.
Yeah, and
this Graham Greene novels hide in and things like that.
Yeah, you go back to the arguments about the people's budget in the Edwardian period before the First World War. The idea of Lloyd, for Lloyd George and people like that, building the foundations of the welfare state, the idea that that dukes are going to pay for it, that there is this definite sense, there are too many people with too much money, and by fiddling with the welfare state, with the tax system and so on, we can kind of bring them down.
And so,
yeah.
when do you think that that's sort of been at its zenith, I suppose? Because it seems to me from my career, which is relatively limited, that sort of attitude has certainly accelerated through the last 20 years or so, but it sounds possibly in Edwardian times it was even worse, or even more.
I don't know. I think actually what's happened among the general public, there's an acceptance now, isn't there? Or there's there's sort of the idea of taxing fizzy drinks or whatever, which I think would have been unthinkable actually in the 1940s, that you would, as it were, punish the consumer for making bad choices. I mean, obviously there's taxes on alcohol, tobacco, and so on, but I don't think they have the same moral charge back then. I think the idea of a sort of moralistic tax is relatively new. I mean, again, we're leaping ahead, but I know later on you want to talk about the selective employment tax, the SET of the mid-1960s. I mean, there was definitely a little bit of an edge there, that there were some jobs that were better, some industries that were better than others, and they should be subject to different tax rates. But I actually think we are more sort of attuned to the idea of social engineering now than probably any generation before us, actually, I would say.
Because I think we've witnessed so much state intervention, especially in the last 5-6 years. I mean, it's. I remember when Rishi Sunak stood up and basically said, "I'm going to guarantee everybody's wages." I was shocked, but now it feels entirely like that's the thing that government should do.
Yeah, I agree completely. When COVID set a sort of precedent, didn't it? I mean, having had austerity just before COVID. So austerity, the idea, there's only so much government can do and it has to be paid off, no matter how painful. I mean, that's the sort of message that the Cameron-Osborne coalition pushed. The transformation from that to the Sunak, I remember exactly that moment. And he repeated, again, the line was, "We will do whatever it takes." Sort of very wartime kind of line.
Yeah.
No matter how much it costs, we will pay for it. Of course, the issue with that is that if you can do that for the pandemic, then the energy bills, what's the next thing? It's not like history's going to stop. There'll be some new crisis in 2025, and people will say, "Whoa, you did it for COVID. Why can't you do it?" I mean, this is
it's almost like it's reset that, and this is entirely out of the sequence that we want, but it's almost like it's reset the events of the 1980s. That government intervention is the base position now, whereas get on with it and make it work.
Yeah,
was in 1987.
A government that says, "Bad luck, no, life can be pretty hard. Suck it up." That's not the thing now, and that's obviously how politics works. That
anyway,
there are moments of consensus, and the pendulum swings. What's acceptable at one moment suddenly becomes completely unacceptable in the next. I mean, that's the nature of political.
So what was the consensus in the sort of late 40s and 50s? Because there were, it wasn't all just Labour governments, was it?
No. And
Macmillan and Eden.
Yeah. So political historians have their characteristically sort of oddly kind of, to outsiders, oddly vicious fights about whether or not there was a post-war consensus. I think
Like lawyers.
Yeah, I mean, I like anything. I guess I would say there clearly was. So although the two parties had very different kind of vocabularies, interest groups, ambitions, and so on, they're kind of on parallel tracks. They both have they both have a horror of unemployment born of their experiences in the 1920s and 30s. So that's the generation of people, the Heath, Healy, Jenkins, Wilson, Callaghan. They all remember the Great Depression. They also remember the war, the idea of people from different classes kind of pulling together. But also, obviously, they're completely shaped by that idea that the state will intervene. The state has a duty, and the state can do it, actually. They've seen the state win 2 wars. So they have a great confidence in Whitehall, in the idea of the Whitehall machine. So because of that, because of the fear of unemployment, because they believe that it is the state's sort of mission to ensure a high level of growth, that you inflate the economy where necessary, and
they do that by pouring money in, right? Is it a money supply question? They just increase the money supply, and then that drives
effectively growth? Yeah, by they would cut tax, cut bank rate, as it was called then. If the unemployment figures go, if 300,000 people are unemployed, they'll take a couple of points off bank rate. So it's called sort of stop-go economics. They're constantly stopping and starting, because the great sort of the thing that's holding them back is that the pound and international confidence in the pound, the fact they're also paying for all this stuff overseas. So that Britain has a terrible balance of payments deficit. I mean, you never hear of that now, because we just take it for granted that we have a terrible balance of payments deficit. But in the 50s and 60s, this is a great concern when the balance of payments deficit becomes too great because people are buying too many imports. It puts pressure on the pound. We're spending.
That's part of the same sort of misunderstanding of the economy, right? That they're conceptually we're still the workshop of the world in their heads,
right?
And that we should be, lots of steel mills and cars coming off production lines, where they don't quite understand that we're shifting towards a service economy.
It's not. I don't know whether it's not that they don't understand it. It's that they. I would say, stepping right back from this, that what you have after 1945 is basically 35 years of governments of both parties that are very nervous about economic change, and understandably so, because they think that Britain has been top nation. Britain has been the great driver of globalization and of economic kind of progressivism, as it were, until the beginning of the 20th century. And now other people have caught up at the beginning of the 20th century, the US and Germany. And now a lot of the change is actually going to be bad for us. I mean, they're right to think it is going to be bad for us, because it is. Japanese motorbikes or whatever. Bad news if you're in Coventry making motorbikes, because they'll make them better than you, and in the long run, your job is doomed. And I think what happens is, after 1945, you have successive governments that really see their job as being trying to shield people from that, to hold on to what we have for as long as possible. And that's why, when you have lots of government intervention in industry, which you have in the sort of 50s and 60s, quite often it's propping up industries that you would think now, looking back, if you were playing a board game of Britain, would you invest your money in shipbuilding? Of course you wouldn't. But they do it because, the electoral they don't want to see, it's a humiliation for these firms to go to the wall. It's very bad publicity for lots of people to be unemployed. If you're a Labour government, they're in Labour areas and so on. So the Wilson government in particular, the white heat of technology government, is actually spending a lot of money on
old technology.
That are not the white heat of. So I think there's
so essentially their solution to global economic change is to stop any change in the UK.
Some people would say I was being much too harsh, but I think that. So there's a great example of that in Tony Benn's diaries. Tony Benn says to James Callaghan, he says, I found out that a lot of our nationalized industries are using basically imported foreign products. What are we going to do about it? And Callaghan says, well, we're not going to do anything about it. I mean, of course they are. They're just using the best, cheapest products. That's how it is. I can't remember exactly the detail of it. And Tony Benn says in his diary, this is an example of how Jim is just such a Tory. You know, this is a very bad business. You know, we should be, and I think there is a sort of sense among a lot of the political class actually that they're just trying to cling on for as long as possible to this idea of a sort of a little island of sort of British industry with all these overseas threats, and they can stave them off for as long as possible, you know, and hopefully somehow the overseas threats will go away. And then what you have in the 70s is a growing realization they're actually not going to go away. They're just going to get worse and worse. And somebody at some point is just going to have to bite the bullet.
So the background to all this, sorry, go on, Harriet.
At this point, you're definitely getting competition in trade. Are you also starting to get some of the what we call tax competition in the modern sense, which is states all looking at taking a bit of the same piece of pie? Because I mean, I think as Grahame and I know, it's in this period, the late 50s and the 60s, when we start to get an awful lot of double tax agreements, which taxpayers tend to think of being there to help them, but they're not really. They're there to help the two states divvy up who gets what. It's to make sure everyone gets the maximum they can.
I think I would say probably no. You do, I think, from the mid 60s onwards, and then definitely in the 70s, have the phenomenon. I know you want to talk about tax exiles. So you have the idea of a brain drain of people fleeing high tax rates and so on. But there's absolutely no sense, I would say, of the government thinking, oh, well, we need to therefore tweak. You know,
so it's more like people noticing the differences rather than the differences being engineered to attract people.
Correct, exactly, because of course this is the point at which you have an 83% top rate of income tax and a 98%,
98%, isn't it?
98% on so-called unearned income. So this is the point at which, you know, the Beatles, tax man. It's the Rolling Stones going off to France. It's, I mean, for me, I think one of the, if anybody is listening who likes football, they will remember that Don Revie, who was the manager of England, went off to manage the United Arab Emirates. I mean, you could hardly have a kind of more richly symbolic moment in the 1977. He goes off to manage the UAE, and he says it's because of the tax structure. It is because I can earn basically in a year in the United Arab Emirates what I would earn in 5 or 10 years as manager of England. You do get sort of, you know, the Daily Express will run a big editorial about this saying, you know, we're being fleeced by the government, too much tax. But I don't think there's any real sense, certainly not in the Labour Party, that, okay, we need to, fiddle with our tax structure. And in the Tory party, you don't really get that until Margaret Thatcher comes in 1975. So I don't think there's any sense of Ted Heath pouring over kind of competitive tax rates in West Australia.
Margaret Thatcher was a tax barrister, wasn't she? She actually understood the system.
Yeah.
Which I think is probably drives that a little bit, because when you've got the person in charge of the levers actually understand how the levers work.
Yeah, I think so. And in the 70s as well, when she comes in, there's a much broader sense of that nations are in competition with each other. But also there's a sort of wider cultural turn against high income tax, isn't there, in the United States and so on.
Yeah. So all the way through this period that we're talking about, the 50s and the 60s, the number of taxpayers in the UK continues to, or the people paying income tax, not just the number of taxpayers in general, continues to rise. And by the mid 1960s, it's pushing up at 20 million. So in 1909, it was 1 million. Then by 1945, it was 10 million. Then by 1965, it's 20 million. It's continuing to increase. Tax is no longer something that people in starch collars and top hats pay. It's something that everybody pays.
Yeah.
And then so that then increases demands on the state, because I paid in, I'm entitled, starts to become more of an idea. And we're starting to get in towards the world where we have memories. But it's so health and welfare budgets continue to increase. So you see that, watch the graph, everything's just going up, right? And the government's intervening more, like you just explained, Dominic. And it still has this outdated taxation system based on income tax and the purchase tax, which the purchase tax isn't raising anything like VAT is at this point, and VAT would at this point. So Jim Callaghan then comes in. I know, Dom, you love Jim Callaghan, don't you? You're big on Jim Callaghan.
There's not many fans of James Callaghan out there, but I'm definitely one of them. Yeah, absolutely.
He's the first Prime Minister I remember, but he came in 1965 as...
He was a terrible Chancellor, I will just say this. He's an absolutely terrible Chancellor.
And he does two particularly big things, one of which is still with us today, and one of which is entirely insane. So, Harriet, what did he do with the kind of gains that were outside the income tax net in his 1965 budget?
That was the introduction of capital gains tax and the creation of corporation tax, so a specific tax for corporates, which I'm just old enough to bemoan the loss of the Income and Corporation Taxes Act 1988, which was much simpler than the simplified acts that we got in the early 2000s, but it's essentially a separate tax for corporates.
And that merges capital gains and income into one, right? For corporates,
it does, but not really.
All right, okay.
It does, but the treatment of capital gains still sits a little, and still today sits a little bit uncomfortably between Taxation of Chargeable Gains Act and the Corporation Tax Acts.
So obviously this is me betraying the fact I don't work in the UK on a day-to-day basis. That's what Harriet's here for. But he also, for individuals, corporate capital gains tax is one of the big changes, right? Because that's a whole new tax. It's never been taxed before. And he gives people an allowance, doesn't he, of what is it, £1,000 a year? They can have £1,000 worth of
gains that aren't taxed.
That works out about £13,500 now.
So, but yeah, I mean, I think that allowance, which still exists, hasn't sort of risen really in line with what one might have hoped.
I think that's an example of something called bracket creep, which is a really easy way to raise taxes. Just don't put up the tax-free bands in line with inflation, and as everybody's wages, and obviously wage inflation doesn't track price inflation quite right, but it does follow it generally. As everybody's wages rise, they automatically move up into the new bands. And then coupled with that, you have inflation, which is driving down the value of your debt. And you can make your debt disappear and increase tax take by doing nothing.
Yeah, that becomes such a big thing in the 60s and 70s, because of course you've got very high inflation. If you've got inflation at 26%, which we had in 1975, lots of people are being pushed into brackets for which they were never intended.
Yeah. And the debt that you started talking about that we owe to the Americans, is going down in real terms.
Yeah.
No, I think we finally paid it off under Tony Blair, didn't we? I think that was
I think that's right.
The last payment was under Tony Blair. So at this point, there's still this really high tax going on, and you mentioned, didn't you, Dominic, about all the tax exiles. That's a matter of perception, right? Isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not organized, industrialized tax avoidance like happened in the 2000s, and clearly doesn't happen now.
90s to a certain extent,
and the 90s now. But that sort of products being sold, and establish a film partnership in the Isle of Man, and make the same film 100 times and lose money every time.
No. I think it's on an individual basis, but of course it's incredibly eye-catching. So the Rolling Stones going to France, or Roger Moore going off to Switzerland, or
Norman Wisdom,
right? Exactly.
I remember watching on Wogan when I was a kid, and Terry Wogan asked Norman Wisdom why he was tax exile in the Isle of Man, and Norman Wisdom got really angry.
Yeah. And
threatened to walk off because he really loved the Isle of Man. But he was perceived as a tax exile, wasn't he? And it's not the most exotic of locations, though I do love the Isle of Man. I used to live there.
Yeah, but there's a sort of, I think there's a point at which, I think in the 70s, being a tax exile doesn't have, because taxes are so high, I don't think it has a terrible amount of stigma attached to it, actually.
See, and that is really interesting, because for me, looking at where we are today and how tax policy is driven today, governments are able to make an awful lot of changes because of that stigma around trying to reduce your tax burden. And if you look back to things like the Duke of Westminster case, which is one of Graham's favourites, and pre-Ramsey cases, but then even up to things like Ensign tankers in the 90s and Barclays Mercantile in the early 2000s, you don't see that that disdain being quite such a driver of either sort of courtroom policy in inverted commas or even government policy, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, there's some very famous cases, aren't there, of tax exiles in the 70s. I mean, my favorite, well, tax has a bad press, I think, in the 70s, generally across the Western world, in a way that it doesn't actually today. And it's not surprising. If you've got 83% top rate of income tax, lots of people hate it and are really, do you think the Beatles did their song Tax Man? Imagine a band doing that now. A song basically complaining about how much tax they have to pay.
They'd be cancelled, wouldn't they?
They would be cancelled, exactly. Whereas nobody cancels the Beatles in the 60s. I mean, my favourite example of this is, I don't know how many of your listeners have kids who have read the Pippi Longstocking books. But Astrid Lindgren, who was probably the most famous Swedish writer of the day, one of the most famous Swedes, she wrote a piece in a Swedish newspaper in, I think, 1976, which basically said that, she was incredibly rich, and Sweden obviously had enormous taxes. And she said, there's a certain point at which when I'm earning, I'm actually losing. I mean, I'm genuinely losing out the more I earn, because I'm paying like 101% or something on these very, and this had a massive effect on, I mean, it changed Swedish electoral politics. There was a sort of, people said, we have gone too far. There is a backlash. Well, I mean, it's hard to imagine a comparable situation now, because as you say, you'd be cancelled for complaining that you paid too much tax. But I think the tax exiles of the 70s, they were seen as, that was seen as a sort of symptom of something that had gone wrong. So to go back to Mrs. Thatcher, she gives a speech in, I think, 1975 or 76, called Let Our Children Grow Tall. And it was a speech in favour of inequality. I mean, openly in favour of inequality as a driver of economic growth and of dynamism. And she explicitly says, she's in opposition, she explicitly says, we have to let rich people get richer. We have to stop, punitive taxation. And she says all this sort of stuff that, we're in a competitive environment now. We'll drive people abroad. We have to have their tax income in Britain, and the only way we'll do that is by cutting the tax rates. That's quite a landmark moment.
That attitude lasts right the way through to Peter Mandelson saying, I've got no problem with people getting filthy rich.
Exactly.
Then, but now it's entirely absent from the conversation.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, you look at the Kwarteng fiscal event and the reaction to that. I mean, it was hard for anybody to make, it was just the cultural sort of space wasn't there in a way to make the case that very rich people should pay less tax than they are paying. But in the 70s, that was absolutely the mood.
There was so much interaction. I'm sorry to occupy this, Harriet, but there was so much interaction, wasn't there, with the state? You could see the incompetence of the state in your daily life. So if the state is taking 98% of somebody's money, and then you have to order a phone from the GPO and it takes 3 weeks, and a man has to come, and then another man has to climb a pole, right, and then another man has to do so-and-so. And you can see the gross incompetence of that organization in your face, and you're funding it. Then you don't want to pay them any money.
Right, exactly. So I think that's the thing, that people don't, most people, of course, are not interested in politics or indeed in tax rates, but they, when they experience these things, when they make sense of them, they do so, they don't compartmentalize them. They see them all as all part of a general picture. So the same newspaper that tells them, there's so-and-so has gone to France because of his tax bill, also tells them that there's a new strike at, British Leyland, or the government is losing X amount of money because of this, or new pressure on the, they all see it as part of one picture. So you're absolutely right that they kind of resent it. So there's an episode of Fawlty Towers where Basil and the Major are lamenting the headlines, and they say more strikes and all this sort of thing. And Basil says how much he hates the workers at British Leyland. He says they spend all their time lying around on the assembly lines, stuffing themselves with my money. And that kind of idea, these people are stuffing themselves with my money. You didn't see that in the sort of in the 40s, where it was sort of, we're all in this together, we won the war. But definitely by the 70s, there's this sort of sense, I'm paying out too much money for incompetence. And Whitehall is running, trying to run too much, I think it's fair to say. If the government is It's one reason why the strikes and stuff are so damaging for the government, because every time the government's own political capital is staked on the outcome, because obviously, it's a protagonist. It's part of the dispute.
Yeah. So the other thing that Jim Callaghan did was the selective employment tax.
Oh yeah.
Which I read. Harriet and I interviewed a guy called Sven Steinmo and his friend John Datoma, who writes excellently about the development of taxation in post-war, and he in his book Taxation and Democracy, he describes the selective employment tax. And I didn't know this. I knew it existed, but I didn't know this. But it was invented 3 months before it was implemented. Like the first idea, and then 3 months it's in. And essentially what it was a tax on employment, so a payroll tax on employing people. Exactly, a tax on jobs. That beloved phrase of the Labour Party. This is a tax on jobs. Well, you're the only people that actually did one. A tax on jobs that was at its peak. It was £2.40 if you employed a man and £1.20 if you employed a woman. This was the 1970s, and then there was a rebate scheme for favoured industry. So if you were in manufacturing, basically they just whacked the service industry on the head for employing people and rewarded British Steel, which they owned. So they were just giving their own money back to themselves. British Steel for making big rolls of steel that nobody wanted to buy. And it really, the selective employment tax really feels like panic has set in.
Yeah.
Because it's so Heath Robinson.
Yeah. Yeah. And it absolutely sort of, it captures the sort of anxiety that they have, that the people have, that I was talking about change, about the idea of changing to a service economy. The idea that was really widespread right into the 1980s, that there was something kind of wrong with an economy based on services. It's kind of unmanly. I mean, you talked about the different rate between men and women, but that actually true industry is putting on your cloth cap and going out and hammering metal and making things.
That's somehow morally better.
It is morally better. It's economically better, which it obviously isn't. But it's also morally better. It's more improving. They're just sitting in an office behind a typewriter or later on a computer. It's kind of, I mean, actually, I think that thing, I said it being unmanly. I mean, this will sound like a weird thing on a podcast about tax, but I think that is a huge part of it, actually. That those old jobs were largely done by men, and that a lot of the new industries can be done equally well by women. Working women in trousers, really terrifying, sitting behind a desk with the typewriter or computer that basically a man doesn't really know how to handle. And this sort of sense, the selective employment tax absolutely has that kind of sense about it. There are some things that we just shouldn't be doing, and there are some things that we should be doing more of. And making ball bearings is absolutely something we should be doing more of. And you'll get your rebate. Whereas if you're actually, working in insurance or something, no good, morally wrong.
Is that also partly driven by the fact that it's a Labour government, and B, there's so much influence from the unions that are so heavily embedded in those?
Yeah. I mean, actually, you probably wouldn't have got that 10, 15 years later when there'd been a big transformation in the unions. They'd become much more white collar. But in the 60s, the unions are still very, very kind of, blue collar, making things. The men who run them tend to be people from the 1930s.
With very thick glasses.
Yeah, very massive, sort of Jack Jones, Hugh Scanlon, huge glasses, kind of ex-Marxists, Spanish Civil War veterans or whatever, steeped in the kind of class struggles of an older era. And they think, we want to protect, they talk about our men, our lads, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But in the 70s, and then obviously in the 80s, what's left of the unions, they're much more white collar, much more kind of secretarial, much more, more black people, more women, more they've moved away from the kind of the old model, which was still very much there in the 60s. And as you say, they've got a massive influence over the Labour government in the 60s.
So debts are still going up. The government's trying to do ever more and ever more. It's not managing to modernise its taxation system. And essentially what we're saying is that by the time of the selective employment tax, they're basically just pulling levers. They've no idea what they're doing. And it feels like there's a bit of a crisis coming. Is that right, Dominic? Does it feel like?
Yeah, I would say from 1967. So 67 is the devaluation of the pound. So Callaghan's chancellorship has been dominated by the balance of payments deficit and by trying to prop up the value of the pound, trying to persuade the Americans to help prop up the pound. They devalue it in 67. He goes as chancellor, replaced by Roy Jenkins. And I think there's a very marked change in kind of the conversation and the tone after 1967. So up to 67, there had been this slight sense of self-delusion. I mean, Wilson had come in on a modernizing agenda, but there wasn't. But after 67, I think there's a much greater sense of kind of weariness, of pessimism. Because after 67, everything just goes wrong for basically 12 years, consistently. 12 years of dreadful news.
Sounds like now.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's you've got if you look ahead from 1967 to 1979, and you go through what happens, the outbreak of the Troubles, obviously, the Heath government coming in and getting into terrible trouble, industrial relations really kicking off, the oil shock of 73, the massive inflation, the 3-day week, 2 minor strikes, Wilson coming in, inflation hitting a peak of almost 30%, bailout from the International Monetary Fund, 76, and then the winter discontent, the end of 78, early 79. So it's a lot of bad news, and there's a real sense of kind of economic. There's a definite sense that post-war boom has run out of steam, that tomorrow won't be better than today, and that Britain uniquely is failing. I think it's a general malaise across the Western world, but Britain seems more afflicted than anywhere else. And so there's a real loss of. So that's one reason, actually, why all that, to go back to your tax exiles point, that's one reason why people who flee the country because they want to pay less tax, they don't get a bad rap, because a lot of people think, well, why wouldn't you flee the country? I mean, Callaghan himself, 1974, Labour when they've got back in after Heath, they have a strategy meeting at Chequers to discuss the massive, the massive indebtedness, the huge inflation, all these kinds of things, and what on earth they're going to do. And Callaghan, and there's a sort of dead silence at one point, and Callaghan says to the assembled, Labour cabinet, well, when I'm shaving, I say to myself, if I were a young man, I would emigrate.
That's not a good look for a prime minister.
He's about to become, well, he's not yet prime minister. He's about to become prime minister. I mean, that is obviously a ludicrous thing for the person who's about to run your country to say, get out while you have the chance.
And was that impression accurate, or was that sort of partially a matter of attitude and approach? Were we much worse off than the rest of the world, or?
We were suffering more acute symptoms of the same disease, I think it's probably fair to say. So the inflation is obviously a widespread thing. The Bretton Woods system, the currency system, has basically broken up at the beginning of the 70s, so there's a lot of currency instability. The oil shock has, and rising commodity prices generally, means that the post-war boom comes to an end. But everybody else coped with it better than we did. I think it's partly because the relationship between the government and the unions had become toxic by the 70s. I also think it's because Britain is struggling because it has so many old industries that are so uncompetitive. Our productivity is terrible. So there's all these extraordinary stats about a British car worker makes 1 car a year, a German makes 28 or whatever, all these kinds of things. So yeah, I think there was a sort of, I mean, it's easy to overstate it. I mean, it's not like we're plunging into the abyss, but I think we were just performing very, very poorly. And then you were talking before about, working with paper and how it's hard to figure out actually a lot of the time what's going on. By the 70s, there's a lot more data than there was 30 years earlier. And the newspapers in the 70s loved all this new data, and they were always publishing league tables, far more so actually than they do now. So
wow.
when you go to a sort of a 70s newspaper like the Mirror or the Express or something, they'll often have European league tables, days lost of strikes or productivity or whatever. And the reason they love to print them is because Britain's always at the bottom. So it's an eye-catching story. You can pin an editorial to it and stuff. And we are often bottom in a lot of these things. I mean, the comparison with Germany, we come out really badly. In comparison with France, we come out very badly in the 60s and 70s. So yeah, I think, and there's all this sort of cultural malaise as well. This sort of sense of whether we're a high tax, sort of low yield economy. In American papers, Britain is always held up as an example of socialism gone wrong. You know, I remember reading a big story from Time magazine about 1975 it's about British punitive taxation. It's a big story about the 83% rate and about the 98% on unearned income. And there's an interview in that with the actor Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and he says something like, in Britain, if you see a man driving down the street, and he said in America, if you see a man driving down the street in a Rolls Royce, you think, oh, I'd like to drive a Rolls Royce. He said, but in Britain, people see a man driving down the street in a Rolls Royce and they think, I'd like to take that man's Rolls Royce away from him. You know, that's the kind of difference.
Yeah, and I mean, something that when we were looking into this, something that I found was a US not-for-profit called the Tax Foundation, and it measures on its own set of sort of factors how well it says countries' tax codes are performing. But one of the things that it says is that a country's tax code is a determining factor of its economic performance, and that where you've got a well-structured tax code, it's easier for taxpayers to comply with. It promotes economic development, at the same time raising the revenue that you need. And I think where you've got low yield, high tax, that's sort of almost the exact opposite of that.
Yeah.
Because you're never, I mean, that can't go on forever. You can keep putting the taxes up, but while yield is low, you're not going to be able to sustain that sort of approach. It's going to spiral.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And this period, I mean, this is really, it's sort of like this runs against the what we're saying, and what we're saying is true, but it runs against the idea that the mid-60s was the shining moment of British culture. Everything is in that slightly overly saturated Technicolor. Everybody's wearing Union Jack.
Yeah.
Pants. Mod jackets.
Yeah.
And so, but I mean, I'm from the north, slightly further north than you, and Harriet's from Lincolnshire. But when you talk to the people that lived through it, it wasn't like that in Durham, and it wasn't like that in the outskirts of Liverpool where my dad lived. And I don't know.
Yeah, you honestly can't talk to my dad about this period because he gets too cross.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely. I mean, the sort of fantasy Carnaby Street image of 60s and to some extent 70s Britain obviously misses the fact that at any given moment, a lot of people felt very pessimistic about the state of the country. Actually, there was an awful lot of anger about politics, and a lot of, you know, we didn't invent disillusionment with politics. I mean, there's an enormous amount of it around in the 60s and 70s. And this explains why basically so many people in 1979 wanted to vote for what was clearly going to be a very disruptive experiment, because they just thought we have to try something new.
So just before we get to that, so in 1973, the big tax change happens, right? So we've introduced CGT in 65, but that's not raising a huge amount of money, and still doesn't raise a huge amount of money. When I wrote an article when Rishi Sunak was talking about he was going to double the CGT rate, and it doesn't. He could triple it. It's not going to raise enough money to pay for anything. It just isn't that big a tax.
And of course, CGT is a tax that it's possible to, if not avoid, at least to delay very simply and legally. You just don't.
It.
You just don't realise again. And I think that does genuinely contribute, because you speak to a lot of people who are looking for the optimum time to sell their assets from a tax perspective. So it's never going to be a winner from that perspective. And to a certain extent, it's possibly viewable more as a social rather than a economic tax.
Yeah. So I think Callaghan said in his speech when he introduced it that he was introducing it as an anti-avoidance measure because people were flipping their income into capital gains.
Yes, and there's an awful lot of very interesting case law from the pre-capital gains period, because of course people still do want to do that a little bit, but the CGT legislation has good measures for preventing that. But of course, the benefits of making sure it wasn't income, it was gains before there was CGT were potentially huge, particularly where you've got income tax rates going up and still nothing on that capital gain.
Yeah. So, but 1973 comes, we join the common market. And because we've joined the common market, we have to change our purchase tax into good old fashioned traditional VAT.
Yeah.
Which had been invented by the French in the 1950s. So we can blame them for VAT. But it's a much broader base, isn't it, Harriet, than purchase tax?
It is. And in some respects, I mean, purchase tax was a bit hit and miss, really. But purchase tax could have been much more progressive than VAT is. Because VAT is seen as quite a regressive tax. And this is interesting because there's a tax policy, sort of tax theory, which says, oh, well, taxes should be as progressive as possible, which is sort of this idea that you only pay once you get past a certain level and you make sure that the people with the most money are paying the most tax. But then again, coming back to the Tax Foundation, what they say is that actually what's much more modern and what tends to work better and fit that mold of the criteria that they say make a good tax system is to have broad-based taxes like VAT. But VAT can be very controversial because, of course, it hits people irrespective of their income. And so it's a much greater proportion of the income of somebody on a low income than it is of somebody on a high income that they're paying in VAT.
It's regressive, isn't it? Because it's I know there are attempts to say there's some echoes of purchase tax where we don't charge VAT on children's shoes and books.
Yeah.
And biscuits,
Jaffa cakes, but we do on digestive biscuits.
Yeah, but that's because Jaffa. No, don't get into Jaffa cakes. It's very.
It's podcast in itself, isn't it? The tax status of the Jaffa cake.
It is. There was a case about marshmallows this week, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was. That's right. Yeah, one of my colleagues was in the Jaffa cakes litigation, and I mean, it went on for weeks.
Didn't Vicky's actually bake the massive Jaffa cake like they taught me in law school?
I don't know. I just don't know.
I was taught that they baked a massive Jaffa cake to prove it wasn't a biscuit.
It's definitely a biscuit. That's what I'm going to say.
When we talk about this in chambers, that's how it always ends as well. Someone goes, it's definitely a biscuit.
I can't stand them, to be honest. I don't like Jaffa cakes.
No, me either.
I think Harriet and I are the only two people in the world that won't eat them. Okay, so but we introduce VAT, and that's very everybody pays VAT and nobody notices. That's the point of VAT.
Yeah, it's sort of lost amid the. I mean, 73 period of very, very high inflation. Anyway, so prices are shooting up regardless. So it's kind of lost actually VAT, because I wrote about this period in entering the common market and so on. And the funny thing is, it's not as you would think there would be a huge, outpouring of rage. The British public, love a bit of an outpouring of rage, but there isn't really one about VAT. I think it's because there's so many novelties in the early 70s, but also it's kind of slightly lost amid the general kind of inflationary pressures of the time, so that it's as though people don't really massively notice it, actually. I mean, I'm sure they do to some extent. But don't forget as well, they've also got a new currency.
So that's an inflationary element as well, isn't it? I mean, just in its basic structure, the new currency drives up inflation, because instead of having 200 and whatever it is pennies in a pound, you've only got 100. Right? Yeah. So it's like that adds. My father goes on and on about the inflation, and I think, and this is completely an aside, the folk memory of decimalisation helped drive opposition to the euro.
Oh, right. That's interesting. I mean, I definitely think in the folk memory, all those things become bundled into one thing. Yeah. They happen within 2 or 3 years. So decimalisation. So people would sort of see, even at the time, people said of decimal, and people didn't like it particularly older people. So people often said, it's just a ruse. It's just a trick to get the prices up. And then I think you've got VAT 2 years later, then inflation hitting its peak 2 years after that. And so I think in the public mind, all those things kind of became melded together in one sort of great inflationary blob.
Just to draw the euro thing to it, my wife's Portuguese, and when they went into the euro, my father-in-law says the same things about the introduction of the euro as my dad does about decimalisation. Absolutely, oh, really? Right, word for word, almost. Like a coffee was 100 escudos, and now it's €5. It's outrageous.
Yeah.
So just to say, so that in 1969, the purchase tax raised 971 million, and in 1979, VAT raised 4.8 billion.
So
there's a huge change, even taking into account the inflation.
Yeah.
And then by the time Maggie's in and her, they said that Labour's accusation was they were going to double the rate of VAT overnight, and they put it up by 99% or something like that, didn't they? It wasn't quite doubled.
They vigorously denied in the election campaign these shocking Labour lies that they were going to double VAT, and then they
put it from 8 to 15.
They increased it by 99.2% or whatever it is.
But by the time she'd done that, it was raising 12 billion. So there's a huge extra take coming out of the economy that nobody really noticed because it's just wrapped up in the price.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although at the time, howls of anger, obviously, when they first do that, because she combines, I think it's the 1979 budget, isn't it? They combine effectively doubling VAT with cutting income tax, and so it's sort of seen, oh, this is a massive change from direct to indirect taxation, and it's to go back to what you were saying about VAT, this is hammering the poor when we should be hammering the rich and all that. But this is obviously part of this huge cultural shift that you get at the beginning of the 80s.
But that cultural shift happens, doesn't it, because of the essential breakdown of civilization in the late 70s.
Yeah, I'm glad you're not overstating it at all. Yeah, you're right. So the winter of discontent, obviously, I mean, the whole thing about the winter of discontent, the reason why it's such a huge thing is that Labour, when Wilson had come in 1964, Labour's thing was that Labour was more modern than the Conservatives, and they were going to modernise Britain. And that had obviously completely fallen by the wayside. But by the mid to late 70s, Labour's, their sort of, their trump card really was, we know how to manage the unions. So there'll be no more strikes. You don't have to worry. We will sort all that out. And then that completely blows up at the 1978-79 with the winter of discontent. When all those sort of cliches that many listeners will be familiar with, the dead going unburied in Liverpool, the kids being turned away from cancer hospitals, all these kinds of things. I mean, they are cliches, but they're true. They happened. And that gives Mrs. Thatcher, an awful lot of political space and capital to go ahead with what she wants to do, which she wouldn't otherwise have had. So even after unemployment has really gone through the roof, and it all seems to be going horribly wrong, people will still say, when they're in Vox Pops, well, you've got to give her a chance because of what went wrong last time. I mean, I don't think you can exaggerate the extent to which what you called the collapse of civilization. How much leeway that gives her to try all these things that she probably wouldn't otherwise have had.
So I was 8 in the winter of discontent. So I've got some memories, though childish ones. The main memory that I've got is being taken to a supermarket chain called Fine Fair by my mother to go shopping. Yeah, I don't know if you remember Fine Fair. Anyway, and they're being lit. There was the thing that struck my mind. There was no biscuits. The biscuit section was entirely empty.
Back to Jaffa Cakes again.
Back to Jaffa Cakes again. No, they were there because they're not a biscuit.
Graham, do you have any concern that your memories of your life seem to be largely connected to food?
But biscuits specifically. But and my mum having to explain to me that I couldn't have bourbon biscuits that week. I mean, I know it's ridiculous memory, but it's what I remember. I couldn't have bourbon biscuits that week because the truck drivers were on strike, and then having to explain to me what strikes were, and I'm 8 years old. I don't need to understand what a wage restraint is. And then there's another memory of going to, my dad had a little factory and going to work in a factory, and the sewage workers had put their picket line at the end of the industrial estate, not at the gate to their sewage works. They've moved the picket line. Right. So all the other businesses had to close because nobody would cross the picket line. And this man threatening my dad with a plank of wood with a nail driven through it because he wanted to go into his own building to go to work. So, I'm not a great trade unionist after that, but those are the kind of things that did happen. I think they did happen, and it was very problematic. And I remember when Margaret Thatcher got elected, the morning that Margaret Thatcher got elected, my dad put the radio on and they announced that she'd won. And my mum and dad cheered
Oh my word.
Which is like, I can't imagine anybody cheering at any election result now, but certainly like it's not the kind of thing that you would admit, would it, in polite company now. My mum and dad cheered when Margaret Thatcher got elected.
No, but what people forget, so the two things I think I'd say about that. One is there's this theory, isn't there, that people only care about politics when it concerns their collection of their bins. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. So the winter and discontent actually does affect the collection of people's bins. And those small details, no biscuits, the schools are shut, the parks are shut, the libraries are shut. You know, you go to the supermarket and there's nothing on the shelves. You go to the petrol stations, no petrol. Those concrete small things are big things for ordinary people not interested in politics. So I think that's what makes it so resonant. And there was something else I was going to say, and I've completely forgotten what it was. Oh, Margaret Thatcher. Yeah. So what people forget about Margaret Thatcher, or don't realise, is that her biggest single inroads were among first-time voters, young voters. So parents, people with young families, all these kinds of things. The kind of people who you'd actually think, in the folk memory, you'd think, oh, well, they wouldn't be voting for Margaret Thatcher. But they are in 1979 because they are sick of the sort of, whereas other people, maybe some older people, have become kind of a bit inured to the idea that everything is going to go wrong and we're just a bit of a basket case. I think what you have is you have a generation of young voters in 79 who actually just not prepared to stand for it anymore.
So she's a change candidate, isn't she? She's we remember her from 1990 as she's been there forever. But in 1979, she's a candidate for change.
Exactly right.
And these old men with grey hair in badly fitting suits have been messing the country up for too long, and it's time to get a new broom in.
Exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So, Harriet, what does Geoffrey Howe do in 1979 in the budget? I know you've got the notes. I gave them to you.
Yeah,
I can tell you what he does if you want.
Oh, yes, please, Dominic, please do. I don't like it when Grahame asks me questions outside of, I have very specific knowledge on tax and horses, and that's pretty much it.
So actually, I mean, the Thatcher government, this is a whole subject for a different podcast, but one of the reasons they...
You can come back and do it.
Or maybe, we'll see. Depends on if you've got to change your Jaffa Cake position first. I'll be frank with you. They want to get inflation down. They want to create incentives. They want to do all kinds of things. But so tax is obviously a huge part of that. They want a more competitive tax regime. So in 79, I mean, actually, the initial changes are much less radical than people remember. So they bring down the top rate from 83% to 60%. I mean, 60% is still pretty high. Yeah. And the basic rate comes down from 33 to 30. Isn't it 33 to 30? I think that's right.
That's right, yeah.
So even though at the time, Callaghan and Dennis Healey, who are still running the Labour Party then in opposition, they sort of say, oh, this is terribly inhumane and regressive and shocking to have a top rate of only 60% and all this sort of stuff. What this actually does is it brings Britain very much into line with with the rest of the common market. Britain's tax rates before that had been a little bit of an outlier. The tax rates in France, West Germany, and so on have been much more competitive. And even the move to double VAT, again, a lot of people now in a slightly parochial way say, oh, this is classic Thatcherite clobbering the poor kind of. Actually, again, this is bringing VAT in Britain into line with most other common market countries.
Yeah.
So we had been an outlier until 1979. And what happens in 1979? Not so much maybe in 1988, the other big sort of tax reforming budget of the Thatcher years. But at 79, we become pretty much more like the norm.
So did we effectively held on to what were sort of socialist or socialist type tax policies for much longer than the people that we were competing in a tax sense against?
Yeah. And then actually for much of the 80s, for much of the Thatcher period, we have what you could argue were quite centrist tax rates. Even, by today's standards, we would regard those tax rates as social democratic, I think, wouldn't we? A 60% top rate of tax.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, no one would think of that as, so that's the top rate of tax for most of Mrs. Thatcher's premiership. I mean, obviously they then do bring it down to 40% in 88. Lawson brings it down. and then there's a huge outrage from the Labour benches. But yeah,
but this is coupled by this effect being continued of more people paying tax. As I suppose women are coming into the workforce, they're coming into tax as well. They're not paying tax before, are they? So there's more. The number of taxpayers is distributed differently. The percentages of who's in what bands is distributed differently, because you're getting many more people at the bottom, because the workforce is expanding to include new people, and people are paying. So I mean, if we think of taxes as one piece and not as customs and excise and inland revenue, everybody's paying VAT every time they buy a Bourbon biscuit, but not a Jaffa cake. And at this point, they are paying it on Jaffa cakes. And then, so tax is just permeating through society in a way that it just wasn't before this period.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I mean, obviously, people are also paying. I mean, they're also paying VAT, aren't they? Without noticing it, on all kinds of things that they weren't paying before. Yeah, I mean, you're. I suppose what you could say is we're much more of a tax-paying, property-owning society than we had been 20 or 30 years before. I mean, home ownership going up, ownership of stocks and shares, but also, as you say, people being drawn into the tax system in a way they weren't previously.
And so, sorry, just to build on that, on one of my personal bugbears in the world of tax, Grahame, you were saying that women were coming into paying tax a lot more. Do you know when women's income was counted as their own for the first time in the UK?
No idea.
1990.
1990. Well, I live in Gibraltar, and it was 2010.
Jersey was even later than that. Jersey, I think, was probably in the last 3 years. I don't know if it might have been 18, but it may
until 2010, married women were classed as incapacitated persons under Gibraltar tax law. And when I had to pay my ex-wife's tax bill once.
It makes me angry just thinking about it.
Yes, it's an entirely bizarre way of being, but there were so many. The excuse that was used here, I don't know if this worked in UK as well, but there were so many allowances that were linked to being married.
That was certainly a problem with the UK changing over, but lo and behold, it became less difficult and possible in 1990, as if by magic.
Yeah, it's not impossible to do when they want the money, is it? Right, so the workforce is changing, and they've not doubled VAT, and that sort of leaves us pretty much where our tax landscape is now, right, Harry? I mean, there's one big event in 1990 when they tried to push this idea of everybody paying further with the introduction of the poll tax, which went slightly awry.
Now this is the poll tax is probably my first tax memory, because I can remember my ballet teacher having the no to the poll tax thing in her front window.
And if you've annoyed the ballet teachers, you really lost it if you're a Conservative government.
No, it wasn't. I grew up near Grimsby. Ballet teachers in Grimsby were not posh.
That crucial constituency.
We've lost them now, teachers. Harry. You've offended the ballet teachers of Grimsby.
But the thing about the poll tax, right? The poll tax was there'd been pressure for, oh golly, maybe 20 years to get rid of the rates. People hated paying their rates. And the Tories had promised they would do something about it and never done it. And it's a classic symbol of the kind of decadence of a government when you dream up a wheeze that you think is brilliant, but your own supporters you're going to completely alienate your own supporters. And actually, the poll tax is also it's a good example of how people remember Mrs. Thatcher being toppled by the poll tax riots, or they conflate those two things. But actually, the poll tax riots weren't really an issue for the government, because the people who were rioting would never have voted Tory in a million years. What was actually the big issue for them was sort of old ladies in High Wycombe, who suddenly have these massive poll tax bills, who have always voted Tory and are like, no, I'll never vote Tory again. That's the kind of the killer for them, actually. And that idea of, it's interesting, that idea of a sort of flat charge that everybody pays and is not linked to your ability to pay, That idea that kind of got stuck in people's minds that that's what the poll tax was, and they thought it was unfair, that the progressive principle, if you like, had become so embedded in the imagination that the offence to the progressive principle was what really outraged people.
It was very visible. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was going to say it's interesting because property tax is problematic, and we've seen it become increasingly problematic in the UK after the last sort of 10, 15 years in particular. So we get SDLT in 2003, which is the switch from stamp duty. Stamp duty was very easy to, if not avoid, at least defer. But then we get SDLT, and then all governments have messed about with property taxes, and they were problematic then. I think they're still problematic now. And one of the reasons in the Tax Foundation sort of assessment that the UK, in terms of its tax system, is middle table, and their primary reason for that is because we collect too much proportionally from property taxes, which are problematic and unprogressive and difficult to police. And so it's interesting that property taxes continue to be something we struggle with. And I do wonder if it's more sort of permissible or more inevitable in a country that is an island, because space will eventually run out. Now, I know in the UK we're nowhere near running out of space. We've seen Hong Kong. I have experience of Jersey, where it is getting very crowded. And you do wonder if that pressure on property taxes is different from the broader international sort of position.
I don't know. A great theory about that. I think there's something about the idea of home ownership, though, isn't there? That's very deeply embedded. Britain has a very high rate of home ownership. The idea of being taxed on your home,
and it's a dry tax charge as well. You earn income, you have money, you pay tax. You make a capital gain, you get money, you pay tax. You own a house, you haven't got anything out of it other than living there, and you've got to pay tax on it. And dry tax charges always feel unfair.
Yeah, I think there's probably some truth in that. The idea the Englishman's home is his castle, that kind of thing. That's what normally the sort of Tory press will trot out whenever there's any talk of a mansion tax or anything like that.
Yeah.
This is a disgraceful attack on the sanctity of the home. All of that kind of thing.
But not quite as sanctified as just charging people for existing, which is what the poll tax was imagined to be.
Yeah. I mean, obviously the caricature of it wasn't quite true to the reality, but that's exactly how it was perceived. That it was you were effectively being taxed just for being there.
Yeah.
And that the disparities, that you would pay as much as that a kind of a dustman would pay as much or conceivably more than a duke or whatever. That was seen as absolutely outrageous. And and clearly what had happened by that point was the government had become fattened by too many election victories, as is always the way, and become complacent and lost the sense of political reality about what it could do and what it couldn't.
And so do you think that this sort of, from a tax perspective, maybe marks the start of the shift from blame or dissatisfaction being towards the government and dissatisfaction being towards a different category of taxpayers? So it's because the position that we have now, or the position as I perceive it to be, is people are generally sort of against the big corporations that aren't really people and don't pay their tax. They don't think the government charges them too much tax. They think those people don't pay enough tax, and possibly is that something we're starting to see at the end of the 80s, that we've got this shift?
That's a really good question. I don't know whether that starts at the end of the 80s or maybe it starts a little bit later. Because I think there's still a sort of abiding sense that it's good to be competitive, that goes through to I would say, you talked about Peter Mandelson and his line about people being we're intensely relaxed about people being filthy rich as long as they pay their taxes. I think that resentment of people not paying their taxes a lot of that is about the idea about multinationals not paying their taxes, isn't it? Countries that are unpatriotic because they're not British. And I think
that's driven by globalization.
Yeah, globalization. And the sort of conversation about globalization, I don't think really gets going in Britain until the mid-90s.
No, I mean,
a lot of it is to do with tech, isn't it? Because a lot of those companies that people point at, they're either big American multinationals, it'll be like, I don't know, McDonald's or something, or it'll be tech companies. And I think that's where a lot of the tax resentment starts to really build. Once people start to say Apple, Amazon, and I don't think you get that until turn of the 21st century, maybe.
I mean, you certainly don't see the first. I mean, the first really big sort of move from the OECD on that was the 1998 paper on harmful conduct in business taxation, and that seemed to kick that off sort of within that broader international context. So it is interesting to see that, and I do wonder if sort of some of this resentment, it's easier to have against a corporation because a corporation isn't a person.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Absolutely. Definitely.
Of course, what's sitting behind it is a ton of people, but yeah, it's easy to go, oh, Apple's got all that money.
It's an other, isn't it? It's not like you and me. It's this odd construct, and it's cheating. But if you think about it, I mean, James Goldsmith, wasn't the referendum party? Yeah. That's the first time I ever heard the words non-dom. I can't remember what year that was, but it was in the 90s, wasn't it?
97, yeah.
97. That was the first time I ever heard the word non-dom, and much less. And he owned great swathes of Belize, didn't he? And much less was made of that in 97 than it would be made of it today.
I think that's true because he runs against David Mellor.
Yeah.
Putney, and they both lost, I think. And Mellor, in his sort of concession speech, said he was gutted that he'd lost, but he was delighted that James Goldsmith had also lost. And he ended his speech by shouting, "Up your hacienda, Jimmy," at Sir James Goldsmith. But I think, yeah, you're right that is a bit of at that moment, because that sticks in my mind because it was funny. It was just humiliating for everybody.
He's clapping like that, isn't he? And jeering at him while he's giving the speech.
Goldsmith was shouting out, out. It was just a ludicrous moment. But you're right. Goldsmith had come back to Britain and basically campaigning as the Mr. Patriotic, hates the EU, referendum, all that sort of stuff. But you're right. He doesn't get as much grief for being a non-dom in the 90s as he would have done 10 or 20 years earlier. And actually, David Mellor's hacienda remark is a bit of a one-off.
I mean, so even there, you think like, so that he becomes a non-dom because he leaves. He's actually domiciled in the UK and then he leaves. So so that's happened to him. It's not like the non-doms that get so much grief now, who are just not from the UK and then have moved in and aren't doing anything constructed or designed. It's just the way that the rules apply to people who don't come from the UK.
So what's interesting, the reason being a non-dom is good for any listeners who aren't familiar with the English tax system is that something called the remittance basis applies to you. And so that means that you only pay tax on income, gains, etc., that you bring into the country, that you remit. Now, that's defined very widely, so it isn't quite as simple as it might sound, but it offers a potentially really good opportunity to keep your property beyond UK taxes. Now, I don't know if you knew this, Graham, but the remittance basis was introduced with income tax in 1799, but it applied to everyone. And it was
so everybody was a non-dom. Fantastic.
Well, you didn't just nobody. It was effectively a different base of tax, wasn't it? Nobody paid income, or nobody paid tax on income outside of the UK, and that was only restricted to non-domiciliaries in 1914, and that stayed stable throughout the whole of the period that we're talking about. That there wasn't any other change. I think in the mid-90s there was an Inland Revenue consultation, which was residents in the United Kingdom, the scope of tax for individuals, and that challenged the concept of domicile, but nothing happened, and the domicile position didn't change until the middle of the noughties, I think.
But it just couldn't be as relevant, could it? Because you couldn't run your Indian steel mill from London in 1950.
Well, absolutely. So I think it was sort of it was inevitably going to become more pertinent as we became with globalization. But I do wonder a little bit.
And I suppose the shift in our economic position, or Britain's economic position, from being the centre to being the place where people who are rich go to live the life and go to the National Opera and all that.
Having made the money elsewhere.
Yeah. It's like a playground. I think that's one of the things that becomes problematic for society as a whole and is at the moment, that this idea that London is a playground for rich people who aren't contributing properly, but they're using our roads, and that's the kind of thought process, isn't it?
Yeah.
Damn them rolling their Rolls Royces over our tarmac.
How dare they? While I'm paying national insurance or whatever percent it is, and that's the conversation, isn't it? So the tax landscape, by the time where we're up to now, which is 1990, the tax landscape pretty much looks and feels like it does now, right? Except with some fiddly bits.
I would say, other than for the internationally mobile, absolutely.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely. I mean, it's actually changed remarkably little when you think about it. It's from 1990 to, I mean, that's the argument that people sometimes make about Blair and Brown, isn't it? That Blair and Brown basically were inheritors of Mrs. Thatcher's settlement that they pretty much keep in place. I mean, of course, they fiddle with it here and there, but by and large, and even the arguments about 40 versus 45 pence in the pound, I mean, those are nothing compared with the arguments that people were having in the 60s and 70s. I mean, people in the 70s would laugh at us getting so hot under the collar about whether or not you have a top rate of 45%.
Harriet, do you see what the fiscal event, or whatever it was called, the mini budget, do you see that as part of a continuum of is it recognizable what Kwasi Kwarteng was doing, that he was trying to do the same as the 83 to 60% rate, or was it just a headline grab?
In all honesty, I can't see that as a continuum of anything. To me, it did come out of left field, and I have to confess, I was listening to the mini budget. I was sitting here listening to the mini budget, and we got to the bit about reducing the top tax rate, and I thought, have I missed something? Was that announced? Did we know that was happening? And I think it was a very odd policy. I don't necessarily think it was a bad one, because one of the things that you see, and this was really borne in for us in the UK when the top tax rate went to 50%, and one of the big economic think tanks did a paper on it, and the last line of it was brilliant, because it said, we therefore, I mean, this big document, we therefore anticipate that the estimated tax take from the increased rate will be 0%. Because what happens is rates go up, avoidance goes up, whether that be legal avoidance, evasion, or just mitigation, but people look harder at how they can stop paying tax. And so you've got your pre-behavior yield, which is what would happen if everybody just behaved the same and you put the rate of tax up. But then you have to take into account this behavior. And I rather suspect that 45 to 40 people are probably going to be, I don't think it would have made much of a difference to the tax take.
I don't think it would.
We didn't have the OBR look at it, which was a huge problem, and made it and sort of meant that it lacked that authenticity.
Legitimacy, I suppose.
Legitimacy, that was exactly the word I was looking for. It lacked that legitimacy, but I mean, it was headline.
It felt like red meat being thrown to the.
It was, but it was also that classic thing. So everything that we talked about, even down to all the sort of very technical nuts and bolts stuff. I mean, tax is always political. It's governments who bring it in, and it's a sort of political statement. And it felt to me like they just hadn't prepared any ground. There's no conversation. It's not like there'd been a conversation for months about was the top rate of tax too high? Was it stopping wealth creation? Was it dampening incentives? Which is the conversation you'd had in the 70s before the big Thatcher cuts. There'd be none of that. It just came out of nowhere. Yeah, it also just felt so cloth-eared, because again, irrespective of the economic rights and wrongs, you have to use your political capital very wisely, and it just felt like at a time when all the talk is of spiraling energy bills and people being unable to afford, to turn their radiators on, to say, so this is our great coup de théâtre. This is how we're going to end that fiscal event, by cutting taxes for the highest earners. I mean, just seemed like a very random.
It's not backed by the injustice of 83%. I think that's what. It was like they were following a playbook. This is what you do,
of course,
without the context of everybody's been disgruntled for 15 years.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like, let's be Margaret Thatcher. Let's role play as Margaret Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe, or Margaret Thatcher and Nigel Lawson, but without any of the context. I mean, I don't think there were high earners walking around a month ago saying, I chafe at the injustice of the 45% tax rate. I mean, I just don't believe those conversations were happening. I think people just accepted the 45% tax rate as part of the furniture. If you
and that's an example of rates going up for emergencies and then never going down again, right? Because it was 40
Right.
and then it went up to 50 and then
yeah.
But I mean, I think the thing is, at the time, 50, because it was half, because you get into that stage where you're almost giving away, in inverted commas, more than you're getting, or at least as much as you're getting. You add in NICs if you're paying them, it's way more. That is, I think, a much more sort of visible problem than 45%, which is really just a little bit more than 40.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Agree. 45%, you're still getting, you still got that perception that I'm getting most of what I earn.
Exactly. And the other context that I think is really interesting, and I'm going to put this through a newspaper article that I saw in probably one of the less intellectual newspapers, which was
the Daily Mail, was
the
it?
Daily Star.
I'm not going to name the newspaper, but it was an article about a millionaire, a very millionaire. I don't think he's quite a billionaire, but the chap who sold Phones for You, I think.
Caldwell.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And apparently this winter, in solidarity with poorer people, he will be only be heating one room in his home. And there is this sort of...
It's 60 meters long.
The Great Hall.
But I mean, there is this sort of... People are very culturally and socially aware of what people think about the rich and having too much money, or there not being fairness. And I think that's a missing context as well, because as you were saying, Dominic, back when it went from 83 to 60, there was this sort of general view that it wasn't fair. And I think now there's a general view that it is fair. And of course, with modern culture, with modern technology, if you're seen to be benefiting from something that's not fair, that can be absolutely devastating for you personally and economically.
And at 83 and 98% or whatever the unearned income rate was, there's nowhere left to go. No. You can't put it up any further, right? It's like any fool knows that if you tax 100% of somebody's income, they're just not going to be bothered.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, it clearly, by the way, I think Labour would probably have eventually brought it down if they'd been in power in the 80s as well, actually. I think the general trend across the Western world at the end of the 70s was an acceptance that income taxes were going to start coming down, and that you saw this in America a lot in the 70s, a sense that you've got to try and promote incentives a little bit more, but that cultural context is completely lacking from 2020s. So I think it was crazy for a new government to make that to introduce itself to the public by saying, well, we're going to remove the cap on bankers' bonuses and we're going to cut the top rate of income tax for high earners. I just think crazy.
So we've touched there, and I think it's time for us to sort of start wrapping up now, because we have talked at some length. We touched there on something that I would like to touch on, which is in the context of the rest of Europe, say, this progression of increasing numbers of taxpayers, the base being spread out, bringing other things into tax which weren't in tax before, and sort of like ironing out. The taxation system in 1990 is much more rational than it is in 1945, it feels.
Yeah, I suppose it probably is. It's been adapted to a society in which most people are working, men and women.
And participating,
more individualistic society, more aspirational, those kinds of things. And it's a tax also, obviously with VAT, a system in which people are consuming in ways that they weren't before.
I mean, if you look at the graph of
money,
if you look at the graph of number of taxpayers for France and the UK, even though in perception wise, France is a much more socialist country than the UK, but I think that might be a function of post-Thatcherite politics. But from what we've just said, but the graph through the century is almost identical. I mean, it levels off in France and drops back down.
I'll tell you a secret about graphs about France and Britain.
Go on.
Any economic thing you like, you look at the graphs for France and Britain, they're almost exactly the same for anything. And of course, the conversation about them is completely different. They're meant to be completely different extremes: Anglo-Saxon ruthless capitalism and French train drivers retiring at the age of 31 or whatever. But actually, in reality, they're so similar, especially the further back you kind of stand.
Yeah.
It's really, really remarkable.
So, and there you go. There's the evidence of it. The graph is almost identical between the two countries. So, I think what we've learned over the hour and 50 minutes that we've been talking.
Not a moment too long, Graham.
No, well, I mean, you did all the heavy lifting. So, is that basically we've gone from a country where not many people pay tax to a country where everybody pays tax, and that's the only way to fund what we expect the state to do.
Yeah. Actually, the big question isn't so much about how you raise the money. It's about whether you expect, how long can we expect the state to shoulder so many burdens for which it's arguably not immensely well suited. But that's an argument. I mean, that's an argument that I guess will never be really resolved, will it?
I mean, it feels like there'll be a period of this and then a new Thatcherite style revolution, which will reset it a little bit because it won't be sustainable. And then it'll just carry on going like that.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I gave a talk to some, I don't know, fund managers or something about a year ago. And they were asking about the size of the state, when it would come down. When will state intervention start to shrink? And I said, well, if you really do stand right back and you look at the last 100 to 200 years, the story is just the state getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and intervention and expectations rising and rising all the time. So even the Thatcher thing, she doesn't really reduce the size of the state. I mean, there are some tiny kind of incremental differences, but by and large, the state is just as implicated in people's lives now as it was in the.
But she decouples the visibility, right? Because she gets rid of. You don't work for a state-owned enterprise anymore.
Right. So actually, the difference you could argue is that an industry is no longer owned by the state or run by the state. It's regulated by the state. Yeah. So all those people who would once have been employed in running the National Coal Board are now regulating, train companies or whatever.
Ofgem.
Yeah, Ofgem. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Well, I think that's it. We've sorted it then.
Well, what I'm taking from this is that it really doesn't matter who's in power. It's always going to end up the same anyway.
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, that's a very, I think there are two things. One, it doesn't, politically, it doesn't perhaps matter as much as we think. And two, nothing divides people more than the Jaffa Cake issue.
But I listened to one of your podcasts, Dominic, and you mentioned one of your old lecturers, and I tried to find it when I was researching this, and I couldn't, so I apologize for not remembering his name, where he basically argued that the state just keeps moving forwards and the politicians are really just interchangeable, and the figures all show that you go in the same direction.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's I can't remember whether this was what I was talking about. It was a lecture I heard that completely changed the way I thought about politics. He was talking about education policy in America. I mean, not exactly the most sexy subject. And he sort of said, everyone says Ronald Reagan was this, and then Clinton, and then, George W. Bush, whatever, big, massive changes and U-turns. And then he said, but actually, if you look at what they do, and education was his example, the government's role in schools and all this kind of stuff, just complete continuity all the way through. The names change, the projects have different titles and supposedly different ambitions, different people running them, but actually the story all goes one way. And I think that sort of runs counter to the way we think about politics, because we think of it just in terms of the personalities, but actually the trends are more important and more interesting.
And wouldn't we be a more civilized society perhaps if we thought about
accepted that?
We
would, but it wouldn't be as fun, would it? Let's be honest.
Right. So Dominic, thank you very much for coming on. It's really, really appreciated for taking your time, so much of your day to chat with us about this. Harriet, thank you very much for your time as ever. I really hope that you make your meeting. And I'll give the normal health warning. As ever, this is no substitute for advice. It is just a conversation between three people talking about tax. Thank you very much for listening. And frankly, I can die happy now.
Thanks for having me. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.